When the board asks you for better direction in the area of risk and risk management, they're often asking for something a little bit more detailed than that. Based on the work that we've done with the American CPAs, Chartered Professional Accountants, and in Canada, the CMAs and CGAs, we've learned that there really are three things that the board is really asking for. The top three concerns are: one, does management have the ability to identify possible risks? Secondly, do we have the ability to assess the impact of those risks against our overall strategy and performance goals? And thirdly, does the organization have the ability to monitor what's happening, and are those risks manifesting themselves? Now, the traditional approach to risk is we take a heat diagram and we plot for each identified risk what is the guesstimate of the likelihood that those risks are going to occur against our guesstimate of what the impact of each of those risks are. Although this is common practice, there are some weaknesses in terms of what management can do about it and answering the board's requests. Specifically, when we've taken a look at this traditional risk approach, we see 5 things. First, each person on the leadership team evaluates the impact of the risk differently. Why is that? Well, typically each member of the leadership team has a different view of what the strategy is. Imagine if you wrote down your top 10 strategic objectives and sent them in a private poll to each of your executives. What are the chances that they would weight or prioritize each of those objectives identically? Because they don't, maybe sales has a higher emphasis on building new sales and opportunities, whereas operations might be on improving how we execute on our existing products and customer needs. They're then going to rate the risks differently. So if they can't agree on the overall strategies, then when they come to take a look at the specific risks, they're obviously going to rate the impact of them differently. Secondly, this approach doesn't allow us to link that risk element back to the underlying strategy and the strategic objectives which are at risk. Thirdly, it doesn't allow us to link back to the processes or projects which are associated with that risk, whether those processes and projects are going to reduce the risk or, in fact, are the cause of the risk. In either case, we don't have the linkage, so it's hard to take specific action. Fourthly, it's difficult to reassess those risks if you change your strategy. In other words, if partway through the year you decide to shift from a strategy of share of wallet to a strategy of penetrating new markets, you have to go back and redo this whole heat diagram. And fifth, it's impossible to surface what is the natural team you should be assembling to help mitigate or deal with each risk. So these are the shortcomings. I'd like to propose to you a better solution, the risk scorecard. And the reason is we're missing the board's objectives. Sure, this approach allows us to identify the potential risks, but it doesn't answer the question of how each risk impacts the overall performance and strategic success, nor does it allow us to monitor the level that those risks are currently occurring. So let's take a look at the response that we helped the AICPA and CMA build around this. What if we did risk differently? What if we listed the strategic objectives, surfaced what their priorities or weighting was for the leadership team for the next year or whatever the planning horizon is? Then we're still going to go out and take the risk register and list those across the top. But what we're now going to do is take a look at a couple of additional aspects for each risk. First, we're going to take a look at how that risk is impacting each strategic objective. See, a risk is going to impact different objectives to a different way. So if we can take a look at the specific objectives weightings and the impact against that strategic objective, we're getting some interesting information. Then we'll identify some leading performance indicators against each of those risk points. In fact, by multiplying those 3 columns, strategic importance times impact times the performance score, we can graphically represent how much risk appears to be occurring in the organization. And we can repeat that for all the other objectives. And we can then add it up to give you an overall risk score for that risk across the current strategy. And then, of course, we can repeat that for each of the strategic risks or risk elements we've identified. In addition to that, we could actually add it up horizontally. So we take a look across each strategic objective and begin to identify what the overall risk is, both strategically weighted and in a zero base. So now we begin to have a more visual representation of the risk, its impacts, how we're performing against it, and what the net result of that is. So now if we go back and take a look at the board's criteria, we're able to identify the possible risks. We're able to understand how each risk impacts each strategic objective, how much it's impacting it, and how important that objective is to the success of the organization. And then finally, we enable the monitoring process to understand how those risks are manifesting themselves currently with enough lead time that the board and management can take action and mitigate those risks before they become detrimental to the organization.